Active History is pleased to present a recording of Penny Bryden's talk, Putting Flesh on the Bones, the meaning of the BNA Act in Confederation Era Canada. The talk was delivered on April 22, 2017, as part of the Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto.
It was, they said, a gladsome midsummer morn, that first day of July in 1867. The 4 million inhabitants of the United Colonies of British North America were entering, quote, on a new career of national existence. Those who thought that celebration was warranted that day would not be surprised to see us, 150 years later, preparing to celebrate not a new national existence, but now a reasonably secure national existence. On the other hand, there were those in 1867 who did, quote, not admire the build of the craft that was this new ship of state. They too would be unsurprised that we continue to tinker with the structure itself, sometimes imagining quite a complete overhaul, other times simply imagining a new coat of paint. Whether or not it has been with admiration, Canadians have been considering the build of that craft for at least a century and a half. Some of those people we expect to fiddle with the document. The judiciary, for example, was immediately engaged in a debate over the meaning of the British North America Act. Provincial court judges were the first to weigh in on the new document and emphatic about their need to do so. In fact, they said, judges were, quote, obliged to declare when, in their opinion, the Dominion had encroached upon the exclusive powers of the provinces, and when the latter have usurped the higher powers of the Dominion. There can be no restraint put upon the due exercise of the judicial power by any authority, Dominion or provincial, for that would be to place those bodies above the law which created them, and granted them powers which are not absolute, and which no legislation of theirs can make so. But of course, it was to be expected that the courts would articulate opinions on the meaning of the language of the British North America Act. As they said at the time, it was their job to do so. So too was it expected that the new parliamentarians would consider, discuss, and give shape to the new Constitution. As Peter Hogg and Alison Bushnell famously argued in 1997, in reference then to the new world of charter politics in Canada, the courts and the legislatures were engaged in a conversation, a dialogue, about the meaning of the Constitution. This was just as true in the years immediately following the implementation of the BNA Act, when the reach of the Constitution was debated almost daily in the House of Commons. But in the years after Confederation, much attention would be paid to the meaning and, more importantly, to the utility of that new Constitution, not merely in the courtrooms and legislatures, but in the kitchens and classrooms and saloons across the country and beyond its borders. The process of owning the Constitution, indeed, began before Confederation, and the task of shaping it, using it, explaining it, and in all ways giving real personal meaning to it, continued from the 1st of July 1867 through to the present. While not a document that has the sort of spiritual significance or rhetorical flourishes of the American Constitution, and is certainly missing its popular provenance of we the people, the British North America Act nevertheless slowly wormed its way into people's daily lives and into their sense of what Canada was. While it did not have the extraordinary symbolic power, or at least it did not in the early years, the BNA Act was beginning to become established as a tool that real people could use. As American constitutional scholar Edward S. Corwin long ago argued, using the Constitution as an instrument or tool suggests a look, quote, to the future and things needing to be done in the future, while a Constitution can only become symbolic when it is in, quote, the consecration of an already established order of things. So, In 1860s, Canadians began experimenting with that tool, naming it, playing with it, and explaining it. Naming was important. The piece of legislation that created Canada, so to speak, was an act of the British Parliament, little more than that which preceded it or that followed it on the legislative docket. But in everyone's language, it was a constitution. Not only did John A. Macdonald refer to what it was that they had cobbled together in Quebec as a constitution, as he explained how it would work during the Confederation debates, but even opponents were in agreement about what this proposed legislation was. A. Dorion mocked it as the most illiberal constitution ever heard of in any country where constitutional government prevails. What it was not was a charter, a more common word in the 18th century until the American experiment legitimated constitutions. It was also not a compact, at least not immediately. Another word more often employed in the 18th and 19th century parlance. Canadians at the center of the Confederation debates were comfortable in naming the BNA Act a constitution, and so too were others. Writers in local newspapers echoed that terminology, as did the members of Britain's House of Lords, who worked to deepen and broaden the new colonial constitution. In the United Province of Canada, agreeing that the BNA Act was a constitution was perhaps to be expected. It was designed to replace, in the words of one local Toronto writer, the, quote, present Canadian Constitution, which is inimical to the interests of Upper Canada. The idea that a constitution could be imposed or could take the shape of a piece of imperial legislation was nothing new to the people of British North America. Across the continent, commentators used the language of constitutionalism easily. In British Columbia, at least some people hoped that they would, quote, soon be standing in the light and liberty of constitutional government. While in Newfoundland, the rejection of Confederation in the 1860s was clearly predicated on the solid ownership of the existing Constitution. Indeed, it was a constitution so tightly embraced by the people of Newfoundland that there was little enthusiasm for giving it up for an uncertain replacement. Let our heart's blood flow to preserve our Constitution under the British flag, declared John Kavanagh in 1865. Enthusiasm for deciding on a name that this Constitution would bestow was also indicative of a move to take ownership of the structures of the new nation. Renaming the new geographical entity was a step, quote, in the formation and legitimation of cultural and political identities. It was also, apparently, fun. The Confederation is a union of colonies. Why not then call it Colonia, said WAS from Owen Sound. Other suggestions from across the new nation included Britannica, Albertania, Ursalia, Borealia, Arcadia, and Norland, each celebrating either the origins or features of the new country. A Canadian offered a different perspective. There is another source, presumably the male Canadian said, there is another source to which we might apply for a name. The whole country was originally stolen from the Indians, and as these sons of the forest are dying out and with them their language, it is a debt we owe to them to snatch up another of their grand, deep-toned words from oblivion, especially when we have such a glorious opportunity of the naming of an empire which was once their own. They have already given us many beautiful names, such as Toronto, Niagara, Ontario, Oshawa, and the Confederate capital of Ottawa. Perhaps if their language were consulted, some striking expression and poetical name might be obtained signifying, quote, the land that the white man stole in the days of old. Ownership, even when being expressed symbolically through the act of naming, could clearly convey guilt, shame, or embarrassment. More commonly, of course, the act of embracing the new Constitution meant celebrating it. And unlike the Constitutional Act of 1791 or the Act of Union 1840, The moment that the British North America Act came into effect was celebrated. Church bells rang and shots were fired in royal salutes. In Ottawa, it was a 101-gun salute following a midnight bonfire to announce the arrival of the new nation. But those were official festivities. Elsewhere, in smaller, more personal ways, people marked the new structures of nationhood. In London, 69-year-old Amelia Harris noted that this was, quote, the first day of Confederation. There has been a review today of the military and volunteers, she wrote in her diary, but also that most of the people have celebrated the day by going on excursions, as it is a public holiday. In Nova Scotia, the not yet quite so famous Sanford Fleming began making preparations a few days prior to the 1st of July and was up at 5 a.m. on the morning of Confederation, putting up flags as the clouds cleared away. The demonstrations in Halifax, he said, went off splendidly. Although these celebrations took on a familiar shape, they were different in kind than the displays of patriotism or imperial fealty, marking battles or recognizing the Queen's birthday. These marked the first step in the process of owning the Constitution, of taking the British North America Act and making it Canadian. But in possessing this new Constitution, this new ship of state, Canadians of all walks of life were empowered to actually use it. In the early years following Confederation, the British North America Act was a tool more than anything else. That was, indeed, how it was sold to the public in the 1860s, as a restructuring that would create advantages for the separate colonies of British North America. We know that politicians of all stripes used the Constitution to either extend federal or provincial power through the courts, taking advantage of the uncertainty about what it all meant to press their particular interpretations. Oliver Mowat was perhaps most successful in this regard, but his regular appeal to the judiciary over arcane matters of constitutional law found a receptive audience in Ontario. Within 15 years of Confederation, the people of Ontario had been enough convinced that the Constitution was theirs to hand Mowat a sweeping electoral victory, essentially on the defense of the Constitution. Quote, the great evil we supposed had been corrected by the Confederate Act is still rife, Mowat told a crowd of thousands campaigning in the election of 1883, and we are no more free than before, as much under the heel of others as when this complaint was first made. He was using the Constitution to underscore his particular version of provincial power, and the people who had originally celebrated the Constitution had embraced it closely enough to base their votes upon it. But one didn't need to be the premier to see opportunity in the new British North America Act. While small manufacturer Robert Hume had bemoaned the adoption of a federation that would leave Ontario, quote, dependent on Eastern markets, in the years after Confederation, his business flourished in unexpected ways. The, quote, advantages of trade now upon us, he noted, came with the new Constitution. For Egerton Ryerson, the new Constitution offered an instrument with which to achieve a system of public education, which he regarded as only possible once that Constitution will abolish the oligarchy of party tyranny and corruptions and give the Parliament its true dignity and to the people their real majesty. It could also be a stick with which to beat those who violated it. For many in Ontario, for example, the almost immediate renegotiation of the terms offered to Nova Scotia represented an egregious misinterpretation of the Constitution, which now stood considerably weakened. It ought to have been the Constitution that prevented better terms, they argued, and that it did not do so severely damaged the document. Similar sentiments could be found in New Brunswick as well, where George Hathaway and others were sent on a mission to figure out how his province could make the Constitution bend to their financial needs as well. He was not as fortunate, finding the new Constitution not quite elastic enough to encompass a more generous financial settlement for New Brunswick, too. Individual peeves and affronts were also constitutionalized. James Curry of St. Catharines, for example, blamed the Constitution for ruining his chances of a Senate appointment. To him, then, the British North America Act apparently both opened the possibility of an appointed Senate and closed it to him in virtually the same line. The years immediately following Confederation offered Canadians an opportunity to get to know their new Constitution. They had welcomed it and celebrated it with all the usual fanfare on the 1st of July, 1867, and in doing so were clearly recognizing something local and immediate rather than imperial or historical. It was the first step toward making the Constitution meaningful in daily life in Canada, rather than merely living within the British statute books. The next step in animating the Constitution, in putting flesh on its bones, was to use it. That first generation of post-Confederation Canadians were quick to employ the British North America Act to their advantage. Many credited it with bringing financial gain, both individual and regional, and many others began to regard political issues through a new constitutional lens. The constitutional architecture that had been imposed was soon understood not just by judges and lawmakers, but by everyone, as having a real configurative and motivating effect. The Constitution could be used to enhance an industry or a trading relationship, to punish unfairness, or to explain mistreatment. With Confederation, 4 million new passengers on that ship of state began to understand how they could use the Constitution to steer it.
You've been listening to a recording of Penny Bryden's talk, Putting Flesh on the Bones, the meaning of the BNA Act in Confederation Era Canada. The talk was delivered on April 22, 2017 as part of the Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world. A symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca, and be sure to subscribe to the History Chats podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts.